welcome back and very good afternoon for the third session, and we'll be discussing on security in the Indo-Pacific development strategy. We have with us Amrita Karambelkar. She is a research associate at the Vivekananda International Foundation. Just to briefly introduce her, Amrita's research focus is on Indo-Pacific. She actually lives in the subject. She breathes Indo-Pacific with specific reference to Quad and the Indian Ocean. She's also pursuing her doctoral from Jawaharlal Nehru University on the subject of naval modernization in Southeast Asia. So she has previously worked with the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and interned with the Indian Council of World Affairs. So Amrita holds MPhil from JNU and MA in Political Science from the place where she is now, Pune, University of Pune. She has written extensively and presented on her subject at various national and international conferences. Amrita will be using some slides, I suppose, and she will make her presentation for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll open for a QA session, if that's okay with us. And do pose questions whenever you feel there's some question. You put it in the chat box, and we will try to pick most of them, and that should be the drill. So Amrita, over to you. Can you
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhargavsula, and thank you everyone, and thank you to ISB and the US Consulate for giving me this opportunity to share on my thoughts on a subject which is also sort of new to me. This is something I really liked preparing for this meeting. So I will share my slides now. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining in. When we speak about the Indo-Pacific, there's so much that comes into it. And right since morning, you've heard about the maritime dimension and you have heard about the overall geopolitics. But even in a subject such as development, is there a security angle involved? And if it is so, what is it? So my presentation today would try to delve into this subject, and I'm hoping that it generates some curiosity and we get to learn from each other. Next slide, please. So let us now look at some basics with regards to the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific, let us understand that as a geographical tale, it's a tale of blind men and the elephant. That is, depending on where you stand, you will define Indo-Pacific accordingly. For instance, for United States, the Indo-Pacific begins from east of India to US's west coast. Whereas for India, the area from eastern coast of Africa to the Pacific constitutes the Indo-Pacific. So there are variations in how you understand the Indo-Pacific. There has also been an argument whether this has to do with India or with the Indian Ocean. So for the purpose of this presentation, when I speak of the Indo-Pacific, please bear the Indian conception of the region in mind. Now, roughly, again, from Indian perspective, let us say there are 33 countries in the region that account for more than 60% of world's population. And the combined GDP of this region is nearly half of global GDP at approximately $51 trillion. This region is strategic since about one third of world's trade and energy flows through this region. India, East Asia are dependent on energy supplies. The sea lanes also carry manufactured goods from various parts of South and East Asia to Europe. You must have learned about these details through Admiral Ruthra's presentation and also about the factors that make this region so strategic from Professor Mahapatra in the morning. My task today is to talk about development strategies in the Indo-Pacific, and in that I would try to bring out the inherent security angle. Now, why do we need to bring security angle, or why should development, which is otherwise such a benign term, why should it be studied from a security point of view? The reason is firstly because in the Indo-Pacific, everything is overlapping. Because the region is so strategic for various powers and for various reasons, there is an interest in the region. As students of international relations, you must be familiar as to how development is one of the tools of great powers to exert influence. We see the same pattern in the Indo Pacific. So, theoretically, there is nothing new about international development strategies in this region. Now, coming back to the basics, this region is as varied as it can get, be it in terms of level of economic and social development, political systems and stability of these systems, security establishment and their capacities, even geography for that matter. Now, all of this has led to a wide underdevelopment. At the same time, countries aspire to grow, to provide better living conditions, improve livelihood of its citizens, but are often left waiting for resources. The needs far outweigh the availability of resources. And when the bulk of regional states are maritime, this challenge only compounds. Next slide, please. This region is also characterized by various kinds of security threats, from traditional security issues that range from territorial disputes to civil wars to deliberate attempts at undermining existing international rules and order. You must be well aware of how deeply the world is dependent on China, even for producing basic items, and how such dependencies can be easily manipulated if need be. This region would also see a tussle over critical technologies. We see that undercover, happening right now, and in the future, this is only going to intensify, which would have implications in the cyberspace and even much wider domains. At the same time, there is a plethora of transnational threats also, wherein there is serious resource crunch, governance structures are inadequate. For example, in the Indian Ocean, which is a classic example, uh, we are living through the coronavirus pandemic, so that requires no explanation. We have seen these things ourselves. How a country can be brought to a standstill without firing a single bullet. But over and above these traditional and non-traditional security threats, we have this sword of great power rivalry hanging on the Indo-Pacific. The US-China competition has unfolded rapidly since the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and not a day passes by when something significant is occurring in this region. In one of the aforesaid security categories, be it traditional security, you see something happening in the South China Sea. In terms of non-traditional security, you see something happening. There are oil spills. There are pandemic is there. There is excessive rainfall and how that is affecting people. So every day we see something happening in this region, uh, and on that basis, we expect that the immediate future is going to be highly uncertain. Next slide, please. Now, as we go and start talking about development, I found it pertinent that I share some details about India's development partnerships, because often we know very little about our own country. So here it will be useful to briefly talk about what India has been doing in its developmental partnerships. Um, Also, because this will also help you understand how development policies actually work on the ground. It's different to study and read about it and look at it from a policy perspective. And this graphic that you see on the right is from 2019. It's not updated, but you can get a sense of India's activities from it. Primarily, we focused on the South Asian neighborhood, and bulk of India's aid or help goes to Bhutan. But Indian overalls and Africa is also very important, and so is now Indian development cooperation happens through these five lines. First is lines of credits for development projects. So lines of credits are basically easier loans, cheaper loans that you provide to countries, and it's up to them how they want to utilize it. This could go for economic development. These are also given as for defense purposes. Extended 100 US grant to Vietnam for the defense purposes. Seconds are grant and aid projects, which are basically self-explanatory. You have any project that they want to do, these are grants. So I think our projects in Afghanistan are under that category, where we've um, built their parliament building. Third is capacity building and technical assistance as developmental partnership. So, and this factor is one of India's strengths, where our English language courses in non-English speaking countries, or our technical assistance, our science and education partnerships. We host a lot of international students into India. So this is all part of our efforts at capacity building and technical assistance. So you must have heard how India has its own experience of democracy. So India has also helped countries to conduct elections, etc. So all of this falls under this category. Fourth category is humanitarian assistance as developmental partnership. So, India, you must have heard in the morning how India is also a net security provider, and our Navy and our maritime agencies are also used to assist you during any disaster during disaster. So that is one of the way we also do humanitarian assistance as our developmental partnerships. The last leg is cultural and heritage cooperation and development partnerships. So, archaeological study of India, for instance, has been undertaking a lot of restoration projects. Vietnam is there also, Cambodia. So this is again a way of our technique, our expertise being utilized for cultural and heritage preservation into foreign countries. Next slide, please. Now, what are some? Let's see some of these numbers. These show Indian development assistance for nearly about a decade. Now, you can see that there are about 19,246 lines of credit that we've given in the last 6 years, close to 99,000 training and scholarships. Country-wise fund allocation. So from 2008 to 2021, roughly about 71,000 crores have been allocated. And in the last 1 year, despite COVID, we have allocated 6,786 crores. Country-wise funds that are dispersed are 63,557 crores. And in the last 1 year, we have dispersed 4,282 crores. As I said earlier, the uh, most of our aid, like the biggest beneficiary, has been Bhutan, but we're also expanding now to further into the neighborhood and also into the Indian Ocean. Now, what is the characteristics of Indian developmental projects, and why this becomes important to understand when we move into looking at other strategies? Um, all of our projects are designed to generate local employment and and economic opportunities. So everything is designed in a way that it helps the local community. It generates employment at a local level. It's not that we just move our people there, they are doing their job, and we get a benefit and we come back. That's not what we do. And that has given us a great deal of goodwill, especially in Africa. But the problem with Indian projects is that there is often this complaint that our projects are not completed on time, and excuse me, what is called the delivery deficit, which is very chronic to us. So while India is doing the best of her capacity, a lot more is required to meet the developmental needs of the Indo-Pacific. Next slide, please. Now let us come at the core of today's subject. First thing, when you talk about development and security, so where does that emanate from? Why do we have this discussion? What led us to think in this manner has to do with the Belt and Road. uh, so what is the Belt and Road? I'll explain briefly. It is China's most ambitious development project for the world. Initially it was called as the One Belt One Road. The BRI envisages a vast network of infrastructure, be it roads, railways, ports, canals, and pipelines. Uh, but it is also an evolving concept with something like the health BRI, which they're talking now, digital BRI. So, in summary, this is a comprehensive connectivity project. I'm not sure how clearly you can see this graphic above, but the lighter blue tells you about what is the Overland Belt and Road Initiative, which is all land based. The darker blue is the what was once called the Maritime Silk Road MSR. That is how it is expected to connect. And the recent development in red has to do with Arctic route, Arctic Belt and Road. What is it called? That is another way of China to circumvent all this Indian Ocean. So we've heard of what is Malacca dilemma. We know what China also fears entrapment in the Indian Ocean. So Arctic is one of its another way to find an entirely alternative route to Europe. I can just pause for a moment so that you can see this infographic. And in the right circle, the Arctic route has been duly emphasized. Now, so you can understand that the BRI is not just about building roads, but it is evolving into something very comprehensive, and connectivity of all kinds, digital health, as I've said, are likely to be brought under the ambit of the BRI.
Is India also
Now,
part?
when we study for,
No, just
I
small thing. Just wanted to check: is India also part of BRI? Because we see that
no,
Calcutta
no,
is also touched there.
no.
Kolkata.
Sorry. So, India has not joined the BRI because our objection has to do with the China Pakistan economic corridor, which passes through our sovereign territory. And our interests have not been paid heed to. As a result, India has decided not to join the BRI. And we are perhaps one of the very few countries that have not joined this ambitious project.
Okay. No, in that
Okay.
map, actually, we can see Kolkata touched there.
Yeah, Kolkata. It's sort of there. So that might be China's plan of doing things. It's their version of how they would want to see things, but we have not joined it. So there's no BRI project in India.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Um, when we study foreign policy, we all know how domestic imperatives form the foundation of a country's foreign policy, and the BRI is no exception to that. Now, China experts will tell you how the BRI is a product of China's conception of its security. First, with its regime security, then its domestic stability, third is its stability in its periphery, and then further out. Now, these are all in concentric circles, and the priority of each of this layer is decisive in Beijing. Therefore, a great deal of attention is given to China's neighborhood. And China would like to limit external influence in this neighborhood. But I won't go any into details on this since this is not the focus of my talk, but just sufficient for us to understand that for China, the BRI is critical for its political security and also for its infrastructure sector. It is also a vision for China to extend its influence, particularly in the areas that have been traditionally neglected by the US and its developmental programs. So there are two components to the BRI. One has to do with the regime stability, and two, it is a way for China to exert its influence and eventually diminish American power. In South Asia, in South Asia part of the BRI, China's aim is to secure its trade and energy flow. In India, we also feel that China wants to contain India to South Asia and also limit New Delhi's influence in its neighborhood. Uh, so, broadly, the BRI posits challenges on four fronts. First, it is systemic in nature. What do we mean by that? As students of international relations, you would be aware of politics of development or developmental aid, how it comes with certain preconditions, may increase yield interests of the country. It is also just as an ideological tool for democracy promotion. The BRI set to challenge this. How does it do so? The BRI offers an assertive tone. It is popularly called a no strings attached approach. Now, as we go further into this talk, you will realize that it is not entirely accurate. But for the moment, let's assume that in theory, BRI is a much easier way for developing world to access funds and loans. Unlike other funding sources, there are no checks and balances or oversights in place in disbursement of funds or in actual infrastructure. The whole project lacks transparency. And also because there are a lot of projects we still don't know what the BRI actually is. And let's say China creates a small bridge or a small road, even that is coated under BRI. So there is no per se standard or reference point we can go and see that this project is qualified for BRI or not. Everything that they're making is categorized under the BRI. Now, so far we've seen that the Western-led assistance would demand high level of oversight and overall high standards. Now, by virtue of being democracies, there is inherent mechanism for domestic checks and balances to where the funding is going. Now, in China's case, a lot of Chinese economic growth and investment comes from state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprise in short term means China's public sector. Now, there is no distinction in public and private in China. All of China's economic activities are fully backed by the state. This is not possible in liberal democracies where the private and public sector are essentially separate. And this is how the BRI and larger Chinese economic prowess is a systemic challenge. It is nearly impossible for a democratic country to allot funds the way China does. It is also not our way to tell the private sector to fulfill sovereign geostrategic interests. Hence, the competition is fundamentally between two antagonistic political systems. The next concern with the BRI is what is called the debt trap diplomacy. Brahma Chelani has coined this term to explain China's developmental funding. What this term means is that China's so called concessional or easy loans are in fact such that it puts the host country into debt. Since the terms and conditions of BRI funds are attractive and apparently with no strings attached, countries tend to bite off more than they can chew. Eventually, the debt becomes unviable, and countries have to service the debt with territory swap or hand over a strategic facility to China as a means of repayment. In this sense, it would also lead to a relationship of dependency on the donor country. Many suspect that Chinese BRI projects are strategically planned and their locations have military potential. Again, just look at the map. Likewise, the kind of infrastructure that China is building under the BRI, roads and railways and ports in particular, all of it has military potential. And in event of a military conflict, these locations would serve as logistic points to the Chinese military. And in peacetime, these ports specifically will provide uh, repairs and replenishment to Chinese warships and fishing and survey vessels, thus enhancing China's maritime reach. Next slide, please. Now, now that we have understood the fundamental concern over BRI, let us examine some prominent cases. Uh, in Sri Lanka, China offered concessional loans. When Sri Lanka was unable to repay those loans, it offered the strategic Hambantota to China on a 99-year lease. For India or other maritime countries, this is a worrisome development because of the access it gives to a Chinese entity, which can be easily used for military objectives. When a Chinese submarine surfaced in Sri Lanka in 2014, it raised alarm in New Delhi. But for locals in Hambantota, Chinese investment is welcome because it can stimulate economy. Second case is the China-Pakistan, which passes through the Pak-occupied Kashmir. China ignored India's objections when this was first proposed. India has been wary to China-Pakistan alliance, and the CPEC is a direct intrusion on India's sovereignty. At Gwadar port is also a concern. Now, this CPEC alternative to the Malacca Straits and also to develop its landlocked peripheries. From an Indian point of view, this has dual use. CPEC is China's, flagship, but it is not. It is also fraught with own set of troubles. Then there are the Chinese are worried about the security of this route, and now with situation in Afghanistan, there is an even more concern of Chinese investments in Pakistan and how this could also come to affect China's periphery in Xinjiang. There are Chinese have also so this earlier what you call for a lack of better word the honeymoon with Pakistan, where China was pumping money uh, in an unprecedented fashion into Pakistan, has also come to some sort of a stop, and Chinese have asked Pakistanis to start paying up. Now, initially, the China-Pakistan economic corridor was aimed to cost dollars, but it has been $2 billion, which is Pakistan's GDP. The spec was plagued by stalled projects, reports of corruption, and terrorist attacks. Also, now when it comes to Gwadar, there is almost no commercial shipping calls at that port. And also, the Lahore metro appears to be economically unviable. Now, although Pakistan formed a 15,000 person security force to protect the CPEC construction, it was not enough to prevent a string of terrorist attacks. Pakistani public has been critical of CPEC, where they feel that it is benefiting China more and not so much to Pakistan, and it has also pushed Pakistan to seek bailout from the International Monetary Fund. In Myanmar, China has backed a project worth 7.3 billion US dollars to develop the Chakfu port on the western coast in Bay of Bengal. In 2018, Myanmar's government decided to scale back the project because the country feared that it would be heavily indebted. Ultimately, the project cost was revised to USD 1.3 billion. So originally it was 7.3 billion. It has been scaled down to 1.3 billion. So look at the difference. Now, this port, the Chakfu port, is again has a direct security bearing on India because it gives China a straight access to the Bay of Bengal. Now, in Maldives, the Sinamale Bridge is an example of how a Chinese funded project has benefited local population. It has reduced travel time and congestion to reach the airport. But over a period, Maldivian government became aware of the quantum of debt it owes to China at USD 3.1 billion. Now, Chinese projects under the BRI were facilitated under the President Abdul Yamin, the previous president, who was known to be pro-China and whose tenure was marked for human rights abuses. Former President Mohammad Nasheed felt that the cost of BRI projects was inflated. The actual debt is a lot more than what is on paper, and there are doubts whether the facilities that are created under the BRI are sustainable to serve the debt. And Nasheed has questioned the business plans of these projects. So why BRI particularly is a questionable model. Whenever you invest money into something, there is a factory that you've set up or there is a road that you have set up, you expect some returns. Okay, that this is the X number of money I have paid, and X into 10 is what I will reap after a certain period of time. But in BRI, that does not seem to happen. So you're pumping in a lot of money. The roads, for example, may not be used to that extent. There's a very interesting case study of the train that China has started across the Europe as an alternative to the maritime route. There are good studies to tell you as to how it is actually unviable because because it's much cheaper to ship your, to use a maritime route to trade and to send your containers than having it to go on the land, create extra infrastructure. So this is one, economically, these BRI projects are not viable. And therefore, it raises questions as to what is the actual motive behind it. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you've that's very intense at that. So if you've seen the last part of the video, it says that China is responding to developmental needs of the region. And in the beginning also, I have said as to how the needs are actually real, and there is a lot of infrastructure that is required into this region. Now let us see, next slide, please. So what are the alternative strategies to the Belt and Road Initiative? Now, so far we have critically looked at the BRI and China's conduct, but the hard reality is that the Indo-Pacific region requires developmental funding. It needs infrastructure, it needs better roads, better connectivity, better urban centers, more employment opportunities. In some countries, the population is aging. They do not have the means to invest, hence, they have to rely on foreign investments to keep the country going. All these factors have served to China's interest. And if we really see this objectively, they've seen an opportunity and they have grabbed it. Let us, for instance, look at the case of Djibouti, which has become China's first overseas base. Now, the Djibouti government initially had an open offer on it. Anybody was welcome to develop it, even India was invited. But we didn't go, no one else went. And so China has taken the opportunity, developed the port, and now it has become theirs. So, in a way, it is futile to be critical of the BRI and not taking any measures on it. In the last couple of years, a few initiatives have been announced. The US has announced the Blue Dot Initiative with Australia and Japan to finance quality infrastructure projects. It brings participants from public, private, and civil societies under shared standards for global infrastructure development. The network will certify infrastructure projects that demonstrate and uphold global infrastructure principles. Certification by the Blue Dot Network will serve as a globally recognized symbol of market driven, transparent, and financially sustainable development projects. So, if you can see, all the principles that are highlighted under the Blue Dot Network are contrary to what we see in the BRI, where we see lack of transparency. We do not know if they are sustainable, they are not responding to market needs or, actual economic logic. So, Blue Dot is an exact alternative to that. In 2020, India, Australia, and Japan announced the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative with the aim of establishing alternatives to China-led supply chain. The catalyst was the pandemic, which showed us how deeply we were dependent on China and how there was an awareness that it is a vulnerability which can be easily exploited. Let us say, for instance, all the masks and all the basics that we need. What if China had just stopped exporting it to us? That in the middle of pandemic. So these sort of fears were actually recognized, and the three countries had decided to set up the SCRI. Now, recently during the G7 meeting, its leaders announced the Build Back Better World Initiative, what is called as the B3G. an affirmative initiative for meeting the tremendous infrastructure needs of low and middle income countries. B3G is a values driven, high standard, and transparent infrastructure partnership led by major democracies to help narrow the 40 trillion plus dollars infrastructure need in the developing world, which has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So very similar to what the Blue Dot network is, but this is led by the G7, so it has European presence. What are some of India's initiatives? We have what is called Security and Growth for All, what we popularly called as SAGAR, under which India has offered funds and capital goods for maritime capacity building to Indian Ocean littorals. Now, the Indo Pacific Oceans Initiative, which was launched in 2019, which has now become the mainstay of India's Indo Pacific outreach. The IPOI seeks to ensure security and stability of the regional maritime domain. IPOI is an open, non treaty based initiative for countries to work together for cooperative and collaborative solutions to common challenges in the region. Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative draws on the existing regional architecture and mechanisms to focus on seven pillars. One, maritime security. Two, maritime ecology. Three, maritime resources. Fourth, capacity building and resource sharing. Five, disaster risk reduction and management. Sixth, science, technology, and academic cooperation. And the last one is trade connectivity and maritime transport. So you can see that all of these initiatives, in some way or the other, are trying to provide an alternative to the BRI. There is a normative underlining to it, and there are also different areas that are not covered into the BRI. For instance, our projects, which are talking about conservation and resource and climate change. So these things are not covered in the BRI, which these mechanisms are trying to address. But what are the limitations of these policies? Now, first of all, uh, infrastructure per se, or building infrastructure into another country is an expensive affair. Why China was able to do that is because the domestic infrastructure sector has grown so much. You know, it's an issue of overcapacity. So they had to sort of invest those capacities somewhere, which led to the BRI. But none of us have that sort of that sort of excessive capacity. Secondly, so far we have not seen much happening through either of these initiatives. So they were announced with a lot of fanfare, but on the ground, there's not much that we have seen. The foremost limitation is funding. Now, the natural expectation is that the US should do the heavy lifting, but we have not seen any concrete commitments as yet. The supply chain resilience initiative again has not seen any movement. It was just announced. Also, because it is a Herculean task to create an alternative to China led supply chains, and it is a long term project. And businesses may not be keen to disturb their existing operations. And when I was talking about, the systemic challenge that BRI poses, this is where it comes down to. We can't be telling our, let's say, Tata or Ambani to that, okay, we are very much interested in Maldives. The country has strategic interest. Please go and invest. We can't do those sort of things with our private sector. Whereas in China, there is no distinction between what is public and private. The state can entirely, I mean, it is all the companies or all the so-called even private initiatives are state backed. So an entire sovereign support is there to all Chinese initiatives, which no democracy can do. It's just not there in our system. Uh, the third problem is that some of these initiatives are value laden, particularly Blue Dot and the B3G. Um, it is one thing to uphold transparency and high standards and quality in infrastructure. But if this is a repetition of human rights and democracy as a precondition, then I have serious reservations whether it will hold through the Indo-Pacific, because smaller countries today have the agency and also an alternative to the BRI. And we're aware of, how Indo-Pacific is a varied region. There are not, there are democracies, there are various levels of democracies. There are various other political systems in the Indo-Pacific. So If you entirely start pushing through the normative version that, democracy and human rights, and then we'll give you funding, then the countries have an alternative in BRI. Next slide, please. Now, lastly, let us understand what are the security implications of all of this. First is has to do with the sovereignty concerns. CPEC is a prime example. It has directly passed through our territory in Kashmir, and our concerns have been ignored about it. Similarly, if the Chokpu port or Sri Lankan port, now if these has can be utilized for dual use, then this can also threaten India's sovereignty. That is one factor. Um, Second has to do with the debt trap, and which also I've explained earlier that we have seen cases in Sri Lanka where this has happened, and so it is designed in a way that you can't repay the loan, so you have to either swap your land for it, or and then use that land for possible dual usages. The third point, which I want to elaborate slightly, is what is called flag follows trade. Now, one of the rationale for BRI is that all of China's trade passes through West Asia, its energy supplies, etc. And whenever, as your trade starts expanding, that is when countries start looking more towards the oceans. So that leads to development of a maritime outlook. Why is it that suddenly a continental country, which may not have had a naval tradition, starts talking about maritime issues? That's because once you start trading a lot more, your uh, external trade, your seaborne trade increases. Naturally, you have to securitize it. So flag, which means wherever your flag refers to your navy. Okay, so wherever your trade is going in whichever region, to secure your trade, your navy naturally follows. So we've seen how China's trade has now reached every nook and corner of the world. So therefore, it's very natural for them to start securitizing it, and they are doing this in various ways. So maritime and navy is just one way, but there are other implications also. Second security implication, now if we understand security from a very broad and a comprehensive nature, it is the BRI is a challenge to a rules based way of doing things. It is also undermining democracy because there is no consensus. It is as in Maldives, you find a a regime that is suitable to you, that is pro you, then you fund them, you just give them money without realizing whether that money is going for the right objective, whether it is being implemented, whether it is reaching the target audience. None of that. It is just driven by a certain strategic interest, and it is also encouraging corruption in a way. So that is where it brings a challenge. And another factor is that, see, India or other countries have been doing developmental assistance, but what is so different about China's is that the scale of Chinese initiatives, they are huge. And there is what that has done is that it has raised expectations of the smaller countries from all of us. That if you can't give it to us, we'll go to China. So as a result, it has put up an additional pressure on all of us to do more. Now, in India's case, we have our own development imperatives domestically, which also we have to service. But at the same time, now we have a parallel problem going on, the geopolitical problem at our periphery, where our influence or our standing in the region is being increasingly challenged. So then again, it puts us into a resource. I won't say crunch, but it puts us under stress. Now, again, the last idea about security, we've seen physical, military security point of view, we've seen normative, is a digital domain. Security, as students, you would know, is an ever expanding concept. We've seen human security, and now digital security is also emerging, where all of you must be aware of what happens in the digital domain. So, China recently has announced a digital BRI. So in ASEAN, for instance, they are connecting, they're making a network of cyber network where there'll be greater connectivity. There are submarine cables. Uh, China's 5G and Huawei is something you might be aware of, and how setting up Chinese 5G infrastructure has its own set of security implications. So, as and when, if that starts expanding, then you have another challenge emerging in the digital domain, which could be in cyber and which could also have implications for space security. Then you also have what is called as the health BRI, which China has announced during the pandemic, which again its vaccine diplomacy is under a part of it. Um, so China is also planning to have a worldwide submarine network of cables, which is related to its digital BRI, which will again which will connect all of world's oceans by 2050. So under all this, the question of data security comes into being. So this is where developmental assistance, which is beneficial in a certain way to certain countries, but it is also throwing up huge security implications for the rest of us. Um, Now, what is next slide, please? So, what do we conclude from this discussion? I hope I've given you enough food for thought and triggered some great questions. But there are a few things we have to understand. Indo-Pacific is a very varied region. Establishing a very common governance structure or a common set of ideas is very, very difficult. We can't just have one way of developmental approach into this country, into this region. It is also a reality that countries require financial assistance, and there is a country that is willing to provide it to them at with a no strings attached approach. As a result, the rest of the countries who feel challenged by China's BRI have a lot to do, a lot to contribute, and how they are going to do that is for us to see. So, with that, I end my presentation and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Amrita. That was very interesting, and you have given a very broad picture. We do have a couple of questions lined up. I think there are a couple from Rituja Mate. Should I read it out? Yeah. So, yeah, Rituraj says that if we see the Chinese strategy in BRI or CPEC on developmental front, it has been open to investments from countries such as US and others, though not much has been achieved by China through this strategy. But it still continues to be a feature the aggressive Chinese economic activities in various countries. So what could be the best strategy to counter this strategy on developmental and economic front? As earlier speakers, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra mentioned that Quad is not a military alliance against China. Then what would be the best strategy to compete with China in this region?
Okay. Can I take that question?
You said, or should I?
I'll speak. I can address this question.
Okay, go ahead. Please.
Okay, so the short answer to that is I've highlighted how there are limitations to how much we can actually do. One, we don't have that sort of an infrastructure over capacity. We can't tell our private sector to just go and put money where they're not going to yield any benefits. So just chasing the Chinese strategy just because they're putting money will drive all of us bankrupt, to be honest. So what we see countries doing right now is that we are creating awareness that what is seen as no strings attached is not actually strings attached. And fortunately, Sri Lanka's example, Myanmar's example has actually raised awareness amongst a lot of smaller countries. And there is a general revision going on about Chinese backed projects. A good strategy for us would be to develop capacities. Now, why is it that BRI projects get through? Corrupt or certain governments is one factor, but it has come to notice that a lot of these countries simply do not have the technical capacity to assess a project. They've never had this before. So the legalities that are involved, the technicalities are involved, they simply do not have the expertise to assess it correctly. So whatever is coming, they're taking it. So this capacity building is where I feel the Quad or the other countries can definitely look into. Thank you.
Continuing with the same person, countries in the Indo-Pacific region are gripped with radicalization based on political religious ideologies. With Taliban gaining significance in Afghanistan, there are possibilities of radicalization getting on rise. What would be the best strategy in your view to keep the radicalization, political and religious, suppressed? Also, do you believe that issues such as radicalization can become a hurdle in the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Okay, interesting question. Um, See, radicalization, what has led to the scale that we see right now, has a lot to do with the use of social media that has really proliferated. Earlier, things were not disseminated at such a scale. So that is why countries are already focusing a lot into cyber security. And there are a lot of seminars that happen. So countries are actually giving a great deal of thought. Even in the last Quad meeting, if you've seen, so cyber security has been taken very, very seriously. So containing radicalization, tapping these, and there are technologies with which you can map these ideals. And to counter something like radicalization is a very slow, will require society's participation in it as well. And you have to always expose how whatever is being fed by, let's say, the extremist is actually a fallacy and create an alternative. So preventing like so technical interventions as well as social interventions will help address this issue.
Excellent. Next is India is not a member of BRI, then why is it a member of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that happens to be a significant financer for the BRI projects in the region?
Okay, I was expecting this question. So we were actually the founder member of AIIB. So see, when initially the BRI started, I mean, let us assume BRI. We are free to imagine BRI as it is an infrastructure project. Is it really bad for us? No, we have our own needs for infrastructure. We've seen how much roads are being built. We also need funding. Where has been the problem? The CEPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which directly passes through our economy, which our country. So China is well aware of our interest. We've raised this issue. They did not pay any heed to it, and as a result, we have not been part of the BRI. But once, so let's say this is a disturbance, and the beauty of diplomacy or international relations is such that um, if that doesn't mean we are going to break down all our relationship with China, despite Galwan or whatever, our trade is still very much going on. But these are ways where we are communicating that this is something we are not happy about, but we are still there in AIB because we have left the door open that if if our concerns are addressed, we might take a revisit. So this is how these are diplomatic maneuvers.
Excellent. Saurav Dattagupta, he is asking, good afternoon, madam. Has the China model reached its maximum level of growth, and is China now in the beginning of the decline phase due to its internal growth, internal growing socioeconomic disparity, global distrust on its motive, and authoritarian politics with false narratives as seen post Galwan crisis and recent flood impact?
People love to talk about China failing, just like they would love to talk about US decline since the 1970s. So China's too big to fail. And I'll tell you why, despite all these things that you're keeping about, these are two minor things, for an entire system to come down. First, these initiatives that I was mentioning about, the alternative supply chain, etc. Why is it not taking place? Because nobody can actually pull out all their industries and businesses from China. Why is Quad not being militarized yet? We still have our own concerns, So these are all these factors that are going in China's favor, and we are all so entrenched into the Chinese economy that nobody's in a position to pull it out. The entire European manufacturing is into China. Who's going to bell the cat? So that's not going to happen. And collapse, if anywhere is going to happen, it'll take another 100 years. So we'll be dead by then. That's not happening anytime soon, to be serious. That's not. So challenges will remain, but the Chinese system has a way of addressing these issues. They know how to keep their regime secure.
Still keeping up to China, Suresh Dhir asks, India has held a great regard for strategic autonomy historically. In light of growing instances of military standoffs, confrontation on India-China front, do you think India will have to give up its strategic autonomy eventually? Do you think that Quad will have to remodel itself in terms of a military alliance rather than a security dialogue? In case India has to restore to this, how will it affect Indo-Russian ties?
Okay. Firstly, our policy of strategic autonomy is going nowhere. So, you have to distinguish between strategic autonomy and what was the non-aligned movement. Autonomy means we keep ourselves at elbow room to act in a way that we want. If this is the situation, if we feel we need to go to the close to the US, we will do it. We want to buy S-400, we will buy it from Russia without affecting our ties with the US. So this is a hedging mechanism. This will always remain with us. Now, as far as the border clash or is concerned, look, we have to fight our own war. Nobody is going to put boots on ground to fight our war. Okay, in maritime domain, you might have some sort of a cooperation, but our wars will be fought on our own, like because we won't go and fight anybody else's war. So that is no reason to give up a strategic autonomy because it is our long enshrined principle, and countries don't change strategies on single incidences. So that policy is going to go nowhere. Um, now, the only thing I will say here is that the way defense cooperation goes right now, the way defense technologies are evolving, you don't really need to be allies anymore. That's all I can say.
Don George Verghese needs some clarity on B3W vis-a-vis BRI. I mean, is it B3W or B3G?
B3G.
Okay, maybe you can.
Okay. Sorry, B3W. Sorry, he's right. So, see, this was just announced in the G7 meeting, and this is again an alternative to proposed alternative to BRI. But there are a lot of questions as to how this is going to come because Europeans themselves do not have funds. They are reliant on Chinese investment into Europe. So, we really don't know how this is going to span out. Like I said, they might just do more capacity building. Like that's my guess.
Right. Arfina Hussain has an interesting question. Does the alternatives of BRI has become effective to counter Chinese growth?
Chinese growth, no. See, so Chinese growth is again, like I said, there is so much of interdependency. You can't just be, cutting out those tentacles. It's just there. Now, the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy that we announced is some sort of a challenge there because now we all want to establish India as a manufacturing hub. And somewhere post-pandemic, there has been some impetus that a lot of businesses have shifted to Vietnam in some fashion. So this is happening. There is also a little bit of awareness in businesses that I spoke to that pandemic and so businesses like stability. They need a secure environment, and something like the pandemic with has sort of dented China's image and the lockdowns, etc. So countries will always move whenever they find attractive laws, attractive security. In a sense, over the years, the labor costs were already increasing in China, and many companies have already moved into Southeast Asia. So that way, that movement is happening, and it might just continue. But Chinese will have another way of keeping the growth, and that's where we have to look at critical technologies. So 5G and space and materials that they're trying to produce. So they are compete. This is where their growth story and the edge will remain.
So there's an anonymous attendee who says we have our concerns of BRI in CPEC passing through POK. Since BRI is coming up in big way at world stage, isn't it we are losing our opportunity, keeping in mind our development in the region and our overall geostrategic aspirations? we raise our concerns in CPEC, but simultaneously involve in BRI in other regions like in our central sectors towards Bay of Bengal?
Um, we have not really lost an opportunity. In fact, this is just the beginning of for us to relook at how we do development. There is enough room. It's not that in every nook and corner China has gone and all their projects are successful. In fact, the smaller countries are more and more favorable. They have also started hedging, and they are also looking for alternatives. Nobody now wants to be entirely dependent on China, be it in terms of trade, economy, or even developmental assistance. So there is a lot of scope for everybody to get involved. The question remains as to how we are going to do about it. Whether we should actually follow the physical infrastructure part or start tackling China from our positions of strength. That is where the policy dilemma remains.
There's a question from Bharat. He says one of the recommendation of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Doklam issue was to increase India's development assistance to the Indo-Pacific region. Will this have multiplier effect on India position in the region? Thereby, will it have positive impact on India's stature in the region?
Absolutely, yes. And this needs to be done because why is it that countries go to China, right? It's not that they have some special love for China. No, it's just coming their way and they're taking it. Like in Djibouti, they wanted to develop a port. Chinese had the money, they've done it. So they're not closing doors on other countries and leaving it only open for China. So yes, our assistance has to increase. And for that, to do any of our external ambitions, we have to first reform ourselves domestically. So our taxation, our bureaucracy, our judiciary, everything needs an overhaul. We need to grow a lot more. Only then, once we grow, we have more money. Is when we can start transferring it outside.
So, just a continuation of that. How could India or any other country in the region could counter China's influence in African continent?
Okay, so I'll tell you what happens in Africa. Okay, the Chinese they go and they're building whatever they have to. But unlike Indians, they don't mingle with the local population. Chinese will have their separate enclaves where they go and live. They don't speak the language. They take their own labor force and they build. So it's the Chinese from mainland that will go build roads and go back. So whereas when Indians go, we use local labor. So we already have a natural advantage to that. So this is where these are our strengths, and this is how we'll have to sort of preserve our goodwill. And a good strategy is where when you serve the local population and you meet their interests without compromising on their sovereignty, or try to talk down to them. That is a good strategy, and that will be applicable be it in Africa or anywhere else. And in Africa we already enjoyed tremendous goodwill.
Correct. So Anjan asks, by when do you see Arctic trade route functional?
Another 50 years, but 2015 will see some movement. That's the plan, that's the strategy plan that we see right now, that they want to make it fully functional, I think somewhat functional by 2030 and then by 2050.
Sarodesh has a aspirational question. Does the infightings in CCP would help peace up fall of development?
Well, everyone's really strategizing how to bring down China, and it's an interesting. We should all note it down.
Yeah.
It will. What it might do is it will put, some sort of a challenge to Xi Jinping, and we keep hearing about it. And they might want to have a more mellowed down leader because Xi Jinping has, with his ambitions, has suddenly put the world against China. And this has come too soon. I mean, the original plan to do this would have been by 2049. But this has started happening, and you've seen how countries are actually coming together against Chinese aggression. So they might want to put, maybe a more a sober or a mellow down person. But as far as the larger ambitions of being a world leader, that won't come in a way. So that will continue. The format might change, the color and appearance might change, but the fundamentals will remain.
So Sanchari Ghosh asks, as you talked about Quad, do you think that India can move well with Quad and can justify its vision of a free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific and being in such a small grouping of Quad at the same time?
Yes, because see, initially we had kept Quad and the Indo-Pacific very distinct. Reason was because our vision of Indo-Pacific was inclusive, and Quad was sort of an what it was, just a group of four members. Now, since the last summit and when the foreign ministers have spoken, we have seen an overlap between Quad and the Indo-Pacific. So now it is one and same for us. And one sec, I'll just have to give me one moment. I'll just put this on charge.
Sure, sure.
So what we now see is that there is an overlap, okay, and we're still deciding what we want to do with the Quad and with the Indo-Pacific. So let's just say Indo-Pacific is a geographical space that we have identified, and Quad is a mechanism. And don't be take carried away, but there are just four countries. These four countries are powerful. The US and India have military strength. Japanese are technical and developmental assistance. Australians are powerful, but the total power that you bring to do something. When four countries come together, it sends a message. It certainly makes Beijing uncomfortable. So this is likely, and all of our objectives may not be addressed through the Quad, but significantly, yes, our security concerns.
So how can EU and India can play a role in Djibouti Code of Conduct in the Western Indian Ocean?
Okay, I'm not really. Europe is really not my area of. I've not really seen so much of that.
Yeah.
But overall, about the European interest that we see in the Indo-Pacific, there is a lot of scope for technical cooperation on enhancing maritime domain awareness. So,
Mm.
sharing data, sharing intelligence, interoperability, or sharing of assets is something are some of these things which we can do. And India has recently joined the Djibouti Code, so let us see how it evolves.
With China at an advantage in CPEC and Pakistan in depth, and being asked to repay, what kind of a conclusion are academics expecting?
How not to behave on a lighter note, but see, this is what I'm saying. It creates a dependency, right? Now you have taken so much of money, nobody is going to bail you out. You again have to go back to China on CPEC. But Pakistan as a country has never really bothered about their own development or going. I mean, for their goals have been extremely limited. It's just fighting against India. And so as long as there's somehow they find a way to make themselves strategically relevant. So whatever happens inside the military leadership remains relevant. And there's I mean, as such, it's just a case in point if you really have to see as to um the failure of democracy or something like that.
So good. I think with that we have done with the questions, and of course we are on dot. Thank you, Amrita, for the wonderful presentation and patiently answering all the questions. Hope you also enjoyed being with us for this session. And with that, I think we will end this third part of it. We have a very interesting fourth part of it. Manoj Kevalramani, he is an expert on China. Of course, for the entire day, we've been speaking on China a lot. But what you learned is a 50% of it. The next 50 is going to be coming from Manoj. So please do stay with us. Just maybe you can stretch yourself for a while and come back sharp at 4:25 or so. Now it is
Thank you
4:15.
so much. Thank
Amrita,
you so much. And I really enjoyed all your questions. I hope I've answered them to your satisfaction.
yes.
And hope to sometime meet all of you in person. Thank you so much and stay safe.
Thanks, Amrita.
Bye bye.